At first, nobody understood what they were looking at. A man in a dark suit, sitting alone near the back of a passenger jet, held the entire cabin hostage without raising his voice. Not with a gun. Not with a scream. With a folded note and a calm that felt wrong, like the calm of someone who had already seen the ending. Years later, witnesses would argue about his face, his age, even the color of his hair. But they all remembered the same thing. He was polite. And on the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, that politeness would become one of the most disturbing details of the case. Portland International Airport didn't look like a stage for a legend. It looked like what it always looked like before a holiday: hurried families, tired businessmen, airline counters lit like small islands, and the low hum of a building that never fully slept. People were distracted, by luggage, by time, by the promise of dinner tables and reunions. In an environment like that, a person could pass through like smoke and still leave footprints everywhere. The man arrived with almost nothing. A small case. A folded newspaper under one arm. No visible panic. No heavy coat. No luggage cart. Nothing that would make an employee turn their head twice. At the counter, he asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle. Not a round trip. Not a reservation. Not a plan. Just a one-way ticket, Portland to Seattle, Northwest Orient Flight 305. The clerk typed. Paper slid. Ink stamped. A simple transaction that would later be replayed in slow motion by people who wished they could rewind time. When asked his name, he gave it without hesitation. Dan Cooper. No middle initial. No story. No explanation. A name that, at the time, meant nothing. A name that would later turn into a myth so large that it swallowed the man who used it. He paid, took the ticket, and stepped away as if he'd just bought a coffee. And if you were watching closely, maybe you'd have noticed one small detail. He didn't scan the terminal the way nervous people do. He didn't look for exits. He didn't look for police. He didn't check reflections in glass. He looked like a man who already knew the route. The aircraft was a Boeing 727, unremarkable to most passengers, but not to someone who understood what that plane could do. Flight 305 was short. A quick hop. A commuter route. The kind of flight nobody remembered after it landed. Boarding was ordinary. Cooper blended in. When the flight attendant glanced at him, she saw what she would later describe as businesslike. Dark suit. White shirt. Tie. Clean shoes. No distinctive accent that she could recall with confidence. He took a seat in the rear section. And then he waited. There's a moment in every real crime story, especially the ones that become famous, where you want to believe the villain did something dramatic at the start. A slip. A tell. A flash of evil. But most monsters don't announce themselves. Most of them sit quietly until the moment is right. When the plane took off, Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette. He watched the cabin like it was a room he'd rented for an hour. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with routine smiles. Passengers adjusted their seats. The engines droned with steady confidence. Nothing looked like danger. And that's why what happened next feels so clean, so controlled, so unsettling. Cooper leaned slightly toward a flight attendant and handed her a folded note. She didn't even open it. At first. Later, she'd tell the story with a small shame in her voice, not because she did anything wrong, but because the ordinary world trains you to treat strange moments as harmless. Men pass notes all the time. Phone numbers. Flirtations. Jokes. Complaints. She slipped it into her pocket. Cooper didn't move. He didn't threaten. He didn't smile. He simply said, in a low voice, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words weren't shouted. They weren't theatrical. They were delivered like a fact. Like a timestamp. Her hand went cold as she unfolded the paper. The message was short, direct. He claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted her to sit down beside him. He wanted her to tell the captain what he was about to demand. She sat. And in that seat, in the dim cabin light, she saw something that made the world tilt. Cooper opened his briefcase just enough for her to glimpse what looked like red cylinders and wires. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. But she didn't have the luxury of skepticism. Cooper's voice stayed calm as he spoke. He dictated his terms like a man reading a shopping list. $200,000 in cash. 4 parachutes. A fuel truck waiting when they landed in Seattle. 4 parachutes. That part was strange. Too specific to be random. It suggested he understood how authorities might think. If he requested only 1 parachute, police could sabotage it. But 4. 4 implied he might take a hostage with him, forcing the authorities to provide functional parachutes. It was logic disguised as cruelty. Cooper wasn't just threatening the passengers. He was controlling the negotiators. In 1971, the man known as D.B. Cooper hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305, demanded $200,000 in parachutes, and later vanished after the ransom exchange. The flight attendant kept her face neutral, but inside, something else happened, something people rarely mention when they retell the story. A quiet fear that wasn't about death. It was about how prepared he seemed. He didn't talk like a desperate man. He didn't behave like someone making this up as he went. He behaved like someone following steps. And she noticed another detail, small enough to be dismissed, but sharp enough to stay in memory. At the bottom of the note, near the fold, there was a tiny dark mark. Not a signature. Not a symbol. More like a pressed dot of ink, as if the paper had been stamped and the stamp had been removed before it dried. It could have meant nothing. But later, when she tried to recall everything, she would remember that dot with uncomfortable clarity, because it felt like a deliberate touch. Like a private joke. Like a fingerprint made out of ink. The captain was notified. Air traffic control was notified. The plane continued toward Seattle, but now it wasn't simply flying. It was stalling, circling, burning fuel, buying time while authorities scrambled below. And inside the cabin, the tension had a strange shape. Passengers weren't screaming. They weren't crying. Most of them didn't even know. They were just delayed. And that made it worse, in a way. Because people can handle panic. Panic has a sound. Panic has a face. This was silence. Cooper sat in the same seat, smoking and drinking like he had all the time in the world. He didn't rant about politics. He didn't demand publicity. He didn't ask to speak to the press. He didn't want fame. He wanted a transaction. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The flight attendant kept returning to him, bringing messages, receiving instructions, watching a man who seemed almost bored by the fact that he was committing what should have been the crime of the decade. At one point, he spoke again, soft, nearly casual. Everything will go smoothly if everyone does exactly what they're told. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And the most chilling part was how much it sounded like he believed it. By the time the lights of Seattle appeared below, the plan was already in motion. Money was being assembled. Parachutes were being sourced. Police and federal agents were positioning themselves like chess pieces around a runway. The passengers still didn't understand why they were landing late. And Cooper looked out the window like a man returning to a place he'd never been. Because the most important moment wasn't the landing. It was what he would do after the passengers were gone. When the wheels finally touched down, Cooper gave the next instruction. He wanted the aircraft refueled. He wanted the money delivered. And once the exchange was complete, he wanted the plane to take off again. Not to Mexico City, as rumors would later claim. Not to some dramatic destination. He wanted a route. A speed. A specific altitude. He wanted the conditions that only a person with a very particular plan would request. The flight attendant left him for the cockpit, carrying the message. And behind her, in the dim rear cabin, a man with a fake name and a real briefcase sat perfectly still, waiting for the only part of the plan that truly mattered. Because once the cabin emptied, there would be no witnesses left but the crew. And then, the real story would begin. Seattle was ready long before the passengers understood anything was wrong. From the cabin windows, the runway lights looked calm, almost comforting, like a normal arrival. But outside, the night had teeth. Vehicles moved with purpose. Radios crackled. Men in coats watched a plane as if it were a locked room that had just rolled to a stop. Inside, Cooper didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look relieved. He looked patient, as if landing was just another checkbox. The aircraft taxied and stopped. The captain's voice stayed controlled, but the cockpit was tight with fear. They were negotiating with someone who didn't sound desperate. And that was the problem. Desperation is predictable. Calm is not. Cooper gave the next instruction through the flight attendant, word for word, like he'd rehearsed the sentence. Bring the money. Bring the parachutes. No tricks. No sudden moves. Then he added something almost absurdly polite. And please, keep everyone safe. The flight attendant later struggled with that line. It didn't fit the role he was playing. Or maybe it fit too well. The waiting began. Minutes stretched. The plane became a holding cell with seatbelts. Passengers shifted, annoyed, confused, some half asleep, thinking it was weather or traffic or some mechanical delay. Cooper sat in the rear, smoking. His briefcase rested near his feet like a silent animal. Every now and then he asked for a small thing, another drink, another cigarette, like he was trying to make the situation feel routine. Not for the crew. For himself. Outside, the cash was being assembled, $200,000, bundled, counted, verified. Not because authorities cared about precision, but because they were dealing with a man who cared about details. And then the parachutes arrived. 4. That detail hung in the air like a second weapon. Because 4 parachutes meant the authorities couldn't risk sabotage. It meant Cooper had anticipated their instincts. He'd set the rules of the game before the game even started. The flight attendant carried messages between Cooper and the cockpit, her steps steady, her mind racing. At one point, she noticed his hands. They weren't shaking. And there was something else, something so small it almost didn't register. He kept checking his watch, but not like a nervous man checking time. Like a man syncing to a schedule. Finally, the exchange. A man approached the aircraft with a bag. Another with parachutes. They moved carefully, slow, deliberate, performing calm for the person watching them from the back of the cabin. Cooper instructed the flight attendant to open the door. Cold air rushed in. The smell of jet fuel. Rain. The metallic taste of night. The money was delivered. The parachutes were delivered. Cooper inspected them. Not like an amateur. Not like a passenger. Like someone who knew what he was looking for. He tested weight. He checked straps. He examined the harness with a quick efficiency that made the crew's stomachs drop. Because now the question was no longer, is this real? The question was, how far did he plan this? Then Cooper did something that transformed the situation instantly. He released the passengers. One by one, they filed out. Confused. Relieved. Some angry. Most unaware of how close they'd been to panic. The cabin emptied. And as the last passenger stepped off, the world inside the plane changed. It became quieter. Smaller. More intimate. Now it was just Cooper and the crew. A locked room story at 10,000 feet. Except the room hadn't left the ground yet. Cooper turned his attention to the captain. New instructions. The plane would take off again. Immediately. With the money and the parachutes on board. He specified conditions that sounded technical, too technical for someone improvising. Low altitude. Low speed. Landing gear down. Flaps set. The crew exchanged looks. These were not casual demands. These were the demands of someone preparing a machine for a very specific move. A move that involved a door and a fall. The captain tried to negotiate, tried to delay, tried to gently probe for anything, an accent, a motive, a personal detail. Cooper gave him nothing. Just the route. Just the rules. And then, another unsettling moment of politeness. "Captain," Cooper said, "I'm not asking to hurt anyone. But I will do what I have to do." He didn't say it with anger. He said it like a man describing physics. The flight attendant was told to remain on board. She protested. Cooper refused. He needed a minimal crew. He needed the cockpit functioning. He needed the aircraft obedient. As the engines roared back to life, the plane began to move. The runway lights slid past the windows like a film reel. The last safe moment was already gone. The aircraft lifted into the dark again, Seattle falling away beneath them. The flight attendant sat alone for a moment, listening to the hum of the cabin, feeling the pressure change. Then Cooper spoke to her, quiet but direct. "Go to the cockpit. Close the door. Stay there." She hesitated. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her, calm, unblinking, and she understood something that scared her more than the bomb. He wasn't bluffing about control. He had been in control since Portland. She walked forward. The cockpit door shut behind her. And for the last time that night, someone saw Dan Cooper's face. Behind that closed door, the crew listened. They couldn't see him. But they could hear movement in the cabin. Soft, deliberate sounds. Straps, fabric, metal against metal. Then, a new sound. A mechanical shift, faint, but unmistakable to the pilots. The rear stairs. Something changed in the aircraft's balance, like a mouth opening. The captain's hands tightened on the controls. Because the plane wasn't just flying anymore. It was preparing to let a man step out of it. And none of them knew whether the next sound they heard would be a jump. Or an explosion. For the crew, the strangest part wasn't the bomb. It wasn't the ransom. It wasn't even the idea of a man stepping into open air at night. It was the way the airplane answered him. The Boeing 727 had a personality when you flew it long enough. It complained when you pushed it, sighed when you eased it, and spoke in small changes, pressure, vibration, pitch, that only pilots learn to translate. And now, as Flight 305 cut through the cold darkness at low altitude and low speed, the aircraft began to speak in a new language. A shiver ran through the fuselage. Then another, deeper, heavier, like something mechanical had unlocked in the tail. The captain's eyes flicked from the instruments to the sealed cockpit door, then back to the instruments again. The co-pilot leaned closer, listening, not with his ears, but with his hands on the yoke, feeling the vibration through the controls. Somewhere behind them, the aft stairs were moving. At first it was subtle. A change in drag. A breath of turbulence where there shouldn't be turbulence. The plane held steady, but it felt like a door had opened in a house you thought was locked. The flight attendant sat in the jump seat, facing forward, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. She had learned something in the last hour. Fear doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as stillness, your body trying to disappear inside itself. The cockpit was dim, lit by the blue-green glow of instrument panels. Outside the windshield, nothing but black sky, occasional pinpricks of distant lights far below, and the faint suggestion of cloud. The captain keyed the intercom. "Cooper," he said, voice even. "We're holding your requested speed and altitude." No reply. He tried again, carefully, as if raising his voice could shatter something. "Cooper, confirm you're okay back there." Nothing. Only the low, constant roar of air, and underneath it, a thin, creeping hiss that hadn't been there before. The flight attendant recognized it instantly. Wind. Not around the plane. Inside it. The rear of the aircraft was breathing cold air. The co-pilot swallowed and kept his eyes on the gauges. The captain shifted slightly in his seat, compensating by instinct, micro-movements to keep the aircraft stable. He didn't want sudden changes. Cooper had been clear, no tricks. No sudden moves. No heroics. But here was the problem. Even if they did everything right, the plane itself might betray them. An open stairway changed the balance of the aircraft, created new drag, new vibration patterns. It was like flying with a wound. Another shudder. Then a single, heavy clunk that traveled forward through the cabin floor like the closing of a vault. The flight attendant's mouth went dry. She couldn't see it, but she could picture it. The aft stairs lowering into the storm, the metal steps slick with rain, the night wind ripping at them. She imagined Cooper standing over that opening, money strapped to him, parachute harness cutting into his shoulders. And what scared her most was the thought that he looked calm doing it. Because calm meant certainty. And certainty meant he had rehearsed this moment in his mind so many times that reality was just the final repetition. The captain touched the intercom again, softer now, almost human. "Cooper, if you can hear me, be careful." Still no answer. The only sound was the hiss of air, and then, something else. A brief burst of static. It wasn't the usual random crackle. It came in pulses. 3 short pops, pause. 3 again, pause, then a longer drawn-out hiss like breath held too long. The flight attendant stiffened. She remembered the note from earlier. She remembered the fold. And she remembered that tiny ink dot at the bottom. Small, dark, precise, like a mark left on purpose, but not meant to be understood quickly. A silly thought pushed into her mind. What if this whole thing is a language? Not spoken language, signals, steps, timing, quiet markers. A man communicating with the world without ever giving it his real voice. The co-pilot frowned, listening to the static fade back into silence. Probably interference, he muttered, more to convince himself than anyone else. The captain didn't respond. He kept flying. Below them, the Pacific Northwest stretched out like an ocean of trees, black, dense, endless. Mountains hid behind clouds. Rivers cut invisible paths through the darkness. If a man landed down there, he could vanish into it the way a dropped coin vanishes into deep water. The flight attendant stared at the cockpit door, as if she might hear footsteps on the other side. Then she did. Not clearly, not like in a movie, but a faint vibration through the floor, a subtle rhythm that didn't match engine vibration. A human cadence. 1 step. Then another. And then a pause. The captain's eyes flicked to the co-pilot. "Did you feel that?" the captain whispered. The co-pilot nodded once. The flight attendant stopped breathing without realizing it. Because that rhythm wasn't random. It was a man walking toward open air. The captain keyed the intercom again. "Cooper, last chance to talk to us. Confirm you're about to jump." Silence. Then, another soft burst of static, shorter this time, almost like a reply made out of noise. The flight attendant felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. A thought came to her, sudden and sharp. What if he isn't alone? Not physically. Not another hijacker in the cabin. But alone in the way normal people are alone. Cooper had carried himself like someone moving through a plan that was bigger than him, like an agent following a script written elsewhere. Like a man who wasn't making decisions, only executing them. And then another thought followed it. Worse, quieter. What if he wants to disappear so badly that he has practiced becoming a ghost? The aircraft jolted slightly, not enough to panic the pilots, but enough to confirm something had changed again. The captain compensated, keeping the plane steady, eyes locked on altitude and speed. The co-pilot leaned forward. "Pressure's fluctuating a bit," he said. "Nothing catastrophic. Just weird. Weird." That was the perfect word for the entire night. The captain spoke into the intercom once more, voice controlled but sharper now, a thread of fear finally cutting through his professionalism. "Cooper, you're risking your life. You hear me? The weather's bad. The terrain is." He stopped. Because there was no point. You couldn't talk someone out of a plan they had already completed in their head. And then it happened. The moment that would later become the center of every retelling, every theory, every argument. A stronger shudder. A heavier shift. A sensation like the plane had been briefly grabbed from behind by a giant hand. The captain tightened his grip. The co-pilot stared at the instruments, then whispered something that sounded like a prayer. The flight attendant's eyes widened, locked on nothing. And in the silence that followed, the cockpit listened so hard it felt like listening could change the outcome. Was that the jump? Or was it just the stairs catching wind? They couldn't know. They couldn't see. They were trapped in a forward-facing box, flying a wounded aircraft while a man did something impossible behind a closed door. The captain spoke again, but this time not into the intercom, into the open air of the cockpit. "If he's gone," he whispered, "we may never find him." The co-pilot swallowed. "If he's gone," he replied, "we may never find anything." The flight attendant pressed her fingernails into her palms so hard she almost drew blood, just to feel something real. And then, as if the aircraft itself wanted to punctuate that thought, a final sound slid through the intercom line. Not a voice. Not words. A thin, high hiss, followed by a single, clean click, like a switch being flipped. The captain froze. The co-pilot leaned closer. The flight attendant's heart hammered. Because that click sounded like a door closing, or a latch releasing, or the final step in a sequence. The captain reached for the intercom again. "Cooper." No reply. Only the wind. Only the engines. Only the long black country beneath them, ready to swallow whatever had just fallen into it. And then, quietly, the aircraft's behavior changed again, almost imperceptibly, but enough for a pilot to feel it in his bones. The drag eased. Just slightly. Like the plane had lost weight. Like a man, plus $200,000 in cash, was no longer aboard. The captain stared ahead, eyes fixed, jaw tight. The flight attendant whispered, barely audible. "He jumped." But the co-pilot didn't answer. He was still listening. Because in the static, in the fading hiss, he thought he heard a pattern one last time. 3 short pops. Pause. 3 again. And then nothing at all. The first clue wasn't visual. It was physical. A Boeing 727 doesn't announce a missing passenger with a sound. It announces it with balance, an almost imperceptible easing in the drag, a change in how the air grips the fuselage, like the plane has exhaled something it didn't know it was holding. The crew of Flight 305 felt that change in their hands before they could prove it with instruments. The captain stared at the gauges, then at the black windshield, as if the night might confess. "Cooper!" He tried again, into the intercom, into the cabin, into the void. No answer. Only wind. Only engines. Only the sense that a man had just stepped out of the world. The co-pilot leaned toward the panel, eyes narrowing. "Drags. Different," he said quietly. "Slightly." The flight attendant's throat tightened. She didn't want to say it out loud, because once you name a thing, you make it real. But the captain named it anyway. "He's gone." And in that moment, the cockpit became a room full of people who had just witnessed an impossible act without seeing it happen. They had flown a hostage situation through the sky, and the hostage-taker had dissolved into weather. The captain's mind snapped into procedure. Calm wasn't optional. Calm was survival. He radioed. He gave the situation in clipped, controlled phrases. "Hijacker possibly jumped. Rear stairs deployed. Crew safe. Request immediate interception and instructions." But while he spoke like a pilot, his eyes looked like a man trying to understand something that didn't fit. Because the most frightening possibility wasn't that Cooper was dead. It was that he had planned this so well that he might be alive. The flight attendant stared at the cockpit door. She could still see him in her memory. The suit, the tie, the cigarette held like a habit rather than a threat. The way his voice never rose above a conversational tone. And she remembered that ink dot again. Small, dark, deliberate. A ridiculous thought formed, half fantasy, half paranoia, the kind of thought trauma creates just to fill silence. What if the mark was a signal, not to the world, but to himself? A private confirmation, this is the right night. The co-pilot shifted in his seat. "We should land as soon as possible," he said. The captain nodded. We're landing. Now. They turned the aircraft toward the nearest safe runway, keeping the speed and configuration steady, afraid that any sudden change might do something unpredictable with the open stairs. The plane remained obedient, but the crew could feel it. The 727 was still wounded. Still open to the storm. Minutes passed like hours. No voice from the cabin. No movement. No sound of a man climbing back up those steps, changing his mind, stepping back into the plane. Nothing. And nothing, in true crime, is never just nothing. Nothing is a space where 1,000 endings can hide. When they finally descended, the runway lights rose up to meet them like a trap closing. The wheels hit the ground with a jolt that made the flight attendant flinch. The captain guided the aircraft to a stop with hands that did not shake, because if he allowed himself to shake, the night would swallow him too. Outside, emergency vehicles waited. Agents. Police. Men with radios and flashlights. A choreography of authority arriving late. The moment the plane stopped, the captain exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for hours. And then the next fear arrived. Because now they had to open the cockpit door. Now they had to face the cabin. They waited for the signal from the ground. Voices over radio. Instructions. A careful approach. Finally, open when ready. Stay cautious. The captain looked at the flight attendant. She nodded once, though her eyes said she didn't believe in safety anymore. The cockpit door unlocked with a sound too ordinary for what it contained. They opened it. The cabin beyond was dim, empty, and wrong. No passengers. No chatter. No life. Just rows of seats like silent witnesses. The captain stepped out first, moving slowly, scanning left and right, as if Cooper might still be standing there with that same calm expression, waiting to prove the world foolish for thinking he'd jumped. But there was no man. Only objects. A tie, discarded like it was part of a costume. A glass, half emptied. An ashtray with cigarette remains. The kind of everyday evidence that becomes sacred when a legend leaves it behind. One of the crew members walked toward the back, toward the tail, toward the open mouth of the aircraft. The aft stairs were down. Rain had streaked along the metal steps. Wind surged up through the opening. Beyond it, night. Not cinematic night. Real night. The kind that hides everything without effort. An agent boarded. Then, another. Flashlights cut through the cabin in sharp white beams. They asked questions immediately. Too many, too fast. What did he look like? What did he say? When did you hear the stairs? Exactly what time? Exactly where were you? The crew tried to answer, but the truth was already forming like ice. The most important moment had happened in a blind spot. The hijacker had engineered a crime where the climax occurred off-camera, off-witness, off-proof. And that meant the story could never be closed cleanly. One agent picked up the tie with gloved hands. Another photographed the cabin. Another leaned over the aft stairwell, shining a flashlight into the storm as if light could reach back in time. The flight attendant stood near the seats, arms crossed tight over her chest, as if holding herself together was now her only job. Then she heard it again. Faint, almost imagined, like electricity whispering through metal. 3 short pops. Pause. 3 again. Static. She turned her head sharply. Did you hear that? The nearest agent looked up. Hear what? It's nothing, she said quickly, embarrassed. But her heart was hammering. Because the sound felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with radios. It felt like the ink dot. Like a mark. Like a pattern. As if the night itself had a signature. The captain approached an agent in charge. He's gone, he said. That's all we can say for sure. The agent nodded slowly, eyes cold with calculation. We'll find him. But the captain didn't answer, because pilots learn to respect weather. And the weather tonight wasn't just wind and rain. It was terrain. Forests, rivers, mountains. A place that could swallow a man, and keep him. They escorted the crew off the aircraft, one by one, into the bright harsh lights of the runway. Cameras were not yet everywhere in 1971, but the feeling was the same, a crime scene hungry for details. As the flight attendant stepped down to the tarmac, she looked back at the plane. For a second, she imagined Cooper out there in the dark, still falling, still drifting, still alive. And then she imagined something worse. Cooper on the ground already, somewhere beyond the lights, walking away with a calm that never broke, because nothing had gone wrong. Behind her, agents climbed back into the aircraft, collecting every trace. Ahead, search teams would move into the night. And somewhere between those two forces, evidence and wilderness, the truth would begin to dissolve. Because the next part of this story isn't about a jump. It's about what the world failed to find afterward. The next morning, the storm didn't look like a villain. It looked like weather, ordinary, indifferent, innocent. But everyone who stepped into it felt the same thing: the night had covered for him. In the D.B. Cooper case, a hijacker jumped from a Boeing 727 after receiving ransom money and parachutes, and he was never conclusively identified. Search teams didn't begin with certainty. They began with math. Routes, wind speed, altitude, estimated jump time. A circle drawn on a map that kept expanding every time someone admitted what they didn't know. The plane had moved. The wind had moved. The crew had only felt the moment, not seen it. And the difference between felt and saw was the difference between a pinpoint and a wilderness. They called it a grid, but it wasn't a grid. It was a guess, dressed up as a plan. Helicopters beat the air over dark evergreens. Men in rain gear pushed through brush that grabbed at their ankles like hands. Rivers ran swollen and loud, erasing tracks the way a tongue erases evidence. Every pine needle looked like it could hide a clue. Every ditch looked deep enough to keep a body forever. And in the first hours, there was still a strange optimism. An old-fashioned belief that if you search hard enough, the truth will step forward. That belief didn't last. Because the first thing they discovered was what the locals already knew: you can walk 20 feet into that landscape and disappear. Not dramatically. Not with a scream. Just gone. The ground was wet. The leaves were heavy with rain. A parachute, if it snagged in a tree, might hang like a ghost for years. If it hit water, it might sink. If it hit mud, it might be swallowed. And if a man landed wrong, broke an ankle, knocked himself unconscious, there were places he could lie 10 yards from a trail and never be noticed. In the command posts, radios hissed and maps filled with pencil marks. Agents drank coffee that tasted like metal. They kept repeating one phrase, as if repetition would turn it into truth. "We'll find something." But something was a dangerous word, because it could mean proof he died, or proof he lived. Both would end the myth. Both would end the case. And yet day after day, the forest offered nothing but silence. Then came the first report. A trucker, driving a rural road late at night. He claimed he saw something in the distance, white fabric, moving strangely against the dark like a broken wing. Search teams hurried to the location, cutting through wet brush, flashlights stabbing through rain. They found a clearing, a ditch, a twisted cluster of branches. No parachute. No fabric. No trace. But that report changed the mood, because it did what the case needed most. It gave everyone a picture to chase. And once the mind has a picture, it starts painting. Agents began to imagine Cooper landing and unbuckling the harness with cold fingers. Limping away. Stashing cash. Burying the parachute. A man in a suit turning into an animal that knew how to hide. They imagined him surviving. Because death was too clean. And this crime had never been clean. Days passed, then weeks. The official search areas shifted like storm clouds. Every recalculation moved the center. Every new theory dragged the circle to the left, to the right, north, south. Always somewhere else. And the more the search moved, the more the public story grew. Somewhere in that gap between official uncertainty and human hunger, Cooper became something larger than a man. People wanted him to be a genius. Or a soldier. or a desperate father, or a psychopath. They wanted a motive they could swallow. They wanted a face they could pin to a board. But Cooper had given them almost nothing. A calm voice. A tie. A name that wasn't his. That was the true cruelty. He forced the world to build him from scraps. One afternoon, an agent sat alone with the flight attendant's statement, reading it again, slower this time, like scripture. He underlined details that seemed insignificant at first. The politeness, the precision, the request for 4 parachutes. And then he paused at the smallest detail of all. The ink dot. He stared at that line until it became larger in his mind than it had any right to be. It didn't prove anything. It didn't identify anyone. It didn't place Cooper on the ground. But it felt like a signature. And signatures meant personality. Personality meant mistakes. So the agent did what obsessed investigators do. He made the detail meaningful because he needed something to hold. That night, in a small office with stale coffee and wet coats hanging by the door, he pulled out a radio log. The cockpit transmissions, the ground communications, all the thin threads of sound the case had produced. He listened for patterns. For anything that sounded like a mind leaving crumbs. Most of it was noise. But then, there it was again, written as an aside by someone who didn't think it mattered. Intermittent static. Patterned. He sat up. The crew had reported it. The flight attendant had felt it like a chill. 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 again. It could be coincidence. It could be the airplane. It could be the storm. Or it could be something else. A signal, a habit, a code, someone pressing the same button the same way without thinking. And suddenly the case split into 2 realities. Reality 1. Cooper was a man who jumped and vanished, and the static meant nothing. Reality 2. Cooper was a man who communicated, even in silence, and if the static was deliberate, then someone out there had left a footprint you couldn't photograph. The agent didn't tell anyone yet. Not because he was sure. Because he wasn't. He hated the idea of being the man who chased ghosts. But he hated the idea of ignoring a pattern even more. He rewound the tape again. 3. Pause. 3. And then, almost underneath it, a faint click. Like a switch. Like a latch. Like the sound of a door making its final decision. His skin prickled. If that click was real, if it wasn't just a recording artifact, then it meant Cooper did something at a specific moment, in a specific sequence. And sequences could be reconstructed. He looked down at the map. At the grid. At the shifting circle of search. Then he reached for a pen and made a new mark, small, deliberate, far from where most teams were looking. A place that didn't make sense if you assumed chaos, but made frightening sense if you assumed planning. Outside, rain tapped against the window like fingers. Inside, the agent stared at the new mark, feeling the case turn in his hands. Because if he was right, the forest wasn't hiding Cooper. The forest was hiding the one thing Cooper couldn't carry away. And tomorrow, the search would move. Not toward a body. Not toward cash. Toward a different kind of evidence. Something that could prove whether the jump was a death sentence. Or a clean escape. The search didn't fail all at once. It failed the way cold sets in, quietly, inch by inch, until you look up and realize you've been shivering for days. By the second week, the grid on the map had started to feel like theater. Helicopters still churned the sky. Boots still cut through wet brush. Radios still crackled with the same hopeful phrase, "Nothing yet," repeated so many times it began to sound like a ritual. And then the case did what unsolved cases always do. It turned away from the forest, and back toward the airplane. Because if the ground refused to give Cooper back, the only honest place left was the place he couldn't erase completely. The cabin he sat in, the air he breathed, the ordinary objects he touched before he became a story. The agents called it evidence. But evidence isn't just proof. Evidence is personality, if you know how to listen. And the first object that mattered, more than the cigarette, more than the glass, more than the empty seat, was the tie. A cheap-looking clip-on. Conservative. Forgettable. It was the kind of tie you wore when you didn't want attention. Which, of course, made it the perfect tie for someone planning to become invisible. They held it under harsh light in a quiet room. Gloved hands. Magnification. Careful cataloging. The tie clip looked plain, almost boring, until you stared long enough to see that boring can be deliberate. Because the tie wasn't just fabric. It was a statement: I can wear the uniform of normal. And the man who can wear normal like a disguise is the man you never notice until the moment he's already gone. They collected everything from the seat area: fibers, smudges, tiny fragments of life. They photographed the ashtray. They noted the brand of cigarettes. They documented the glass as if it were a sacred relic. Then they began the slow work, the kind of work the public never romanticizes. Comparisons. Files. Databases that didn't yet have the power people imagine today. Handwritten logs. Phone calls to distant offices. Requests sent in envelopes. Waiting. One agent, older, tired-eyed, the kind of man who'd spent too many nights in fluorescent rooms, stared at the tie and said something quietly. Who wears a clip-on tie on a holiday flight? Someone practical, another agent suggested. Someone who doesn't want to be choked in a fight, joked a third. But the older agent didn't smile. He pointed at the clip. Someone who plans for the moment the mask comes off, he said. And that idea spread through the room like smoke. Because in that sentence was the first real psychological pivot of the case. Cooper wasn't just hijacking a plane. Cooper was designing an exit. Every detail began to look like part of a system. The one-way ticket. The polite tone. The 4 parachutes. The aircraft choice. The silence. The way he never asked to be famous. And then, inevitably, the question that destroys investigators. If he planned this well, what did he plan next? The FBI, and the local teams working alongside them, started building profiles. Not movie profiles. Not dramatic monologues about evil. Practical profiles. Could he be military? Could he be aviation trained? Could he be a former paratrooper? Could he be a man who learned by reading, by watching, by listening? Could he be older than he looked? Younger? Could he be the kind of person who disappears in plain sight because he's been disappearing his whole life? And each question produced 2 answers. If he had training, he was dangerous because he knew what he was doing. If he didn't, he was dangerous because he did it anyway. The case refused to give them a comfortable villain. It gave them a calm man with a note. That's what haunted the crew most when they were interviewed again, and again, and again. Not the bomb. The calm. They asked the flight attendant to describe him one more time. Hair, eyes, posture, voice. She tried. She truly tried. But memory is not a recording. It's a living thing that changes when you touch it. Still, she kept returning to the same feeling. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't improvising. And then she brought up the ink dot again. The tiny dark mark on the paper. The one detail that sounded foolish when you said it out loud. They wrote it down anyway, because at this stage of an unsolved case, you write down everything. One agent listened, then asked a question that made the room go quiet. Did it look like a stamp? She hesitated. It looked like a deliberate mark, she said. Not a signature. Not a letter. Just a dot. A dot. A dot could be nothing. Or a dot could be a habit. Some people tap pens when they think. Some people touch their pocket when they lie. Some people fold paper the same way every time. And some people who live by routines, leave marks without meaning to. The agent who'd been obsessed with the static pulses leaned forward. What if it's his habit? He asked. What if he always marks things, small, fast, before he acts? They stared at each other in silence, because suddenly the case felt less like a legend and more like a man. A man with habits. A man with patterns. And patterns could be hunted. That night, they returned to the audio logs again, Not because they believed in ghosts, but because they believed in repetition. They listened for the static. The 3 short pulses. The pause. The 3 again. It was there. Or at least, they believed it was there. And belief is dangerous in investigations, because belief is how you turn coincidence into certainty. So they did the only honest thing. They looked for a second anchor. A second thing that repeated. A second dot. They reviewed the timeline again, frame by frame in their minds. When did the aircraft shudder? When did the drag change? When did the stairs deploy? When did the cabin pressure shift? When did the crew last hear movement? They made a table. Times. Estimates. Ranges. And then the agent who'd been quiet all day finally spoke, voice low. "There's a window," he said. "A narrow one." The others looked at him. He tapped the paper. If he jumped here, in this window, with these conditions, he either died quickly, he paused, letting the forest swallow that thought, or he landed close enough to reach a road. A road. That word made the room feel smaller. Because a road meant cars. Houses. Lights. People. A road meant he didn't have to become a ghost in the wilderness. A road meant he could become a ghost among humans. And that was the most terrifying version of Cooper. Not a body in the trees. A man who walked out of the dark and into a normal life. The agent circled a point on the map again, darker than before. Then he wrote one word beside it. Egress. Exit. And when he looked up, his eyes weren't excited. They were afraid. Because if the map was right, the next phase of the case wouldn't be about searching forests. It would be about searching people. People who looked normal. People who sounded calm. People who wore suits. People who could sit on a plane and be forgotten, until they weren't. And somewhere out there, if he lived, Cooper was doing the simplest thing a fugitive can do. Listening. Listening to the news. Listening to the manhunt. Listening to the world build a monster out of a polite stranger. And waiting to see whether anyone would ever learn where the exit really was. They started hunting him the way you hunt a face in a crowd. You reduce a man to lines. Back then, there was no viral footage. No phone cameras. No endless clips to replay until the truth fell out. There were only witnesses, human beings with frightened memories, and a handful of details that kept shifting every time someone tried to hold them still. So the Bureau did what it always did when a suspect dissolved into fog. They asked people to remember. The flight attendants sat under hard lights and answered the same questions until the questions felt like punishment. How tall was he? How old? What color were his eyes? Did he have a scar? A mole? A twitch? Did his voice sound local? Military? Foreign? And each time they answered, they could feel their minds rearranging the image, because memory isn't a photograph. It's a story you rewrite every time you tell it. They brought in artists. Sketch pads. Pencils that moved like scalpels. The attendants described him again. Businesslike, calm, controlled. A suit that fit. Hair that didn't stand out. Nothing flashy. Nothing memorable. Which, in a case like this, was the perfect disguise. Because if you want to disappear into America, you don't dress like a criminal. You dress like an accountant. A salesman. A man who pays his bills and says, "Yes, ma'am," and holds doors open. And slowly, a face emerged on paper. Not his face, because nobody could prove that. A face that looked like every man and no man. A face that could be a stranger on a plane, or your neighbor at a barbecue. The first sketches went out. Then the next. Then revised versions. And each time, the public did what the public always does. They tried to see someone they already knew. People stared at the drawings and felt a strange urge to connect the dots. My uncle looks like that. My boss looks like that. That guy at the bar last week looked like that. The problem was that the face wasn't unique. The face was American. Meanwhile, the investigators moved in a direction the public rarely notices. Paperwork. Ticket records. payment methods, handwritten logs, anything that could anchor Dan Cooper to a real identity. But his name was a mask. It didn't exist in the system as a person, only as ink on a ticket. And that forced them to ask the ugliest question. If he used a fake name that easily, how many times had he done it before? They widened the net. They looked at airline employees. They looked at parachute suppliers. They looked at anyone who could have known the 727 well enough to choose it for its rear stairs. They looked at ex-military records, paratrooper lists, men with training, men with disciplinary issues, men who disappeared from paperwork. And the list of suspects began to grow like mold. At first, the names were just names. Then the names became stories. A man with a grudge. A man in debt. A man who drank too much. A man who'd once made a strange joke about jumping with money. A man who had the right age, the right build, the right calm. Each suspect came with a promise. This could be him. And each suspect came with the same disappointment. We can't prove it. The tie came back into the conversation again. The clip-on. The tie clip. The ordinary pieces left behind like the shed skin of a normal man. Investigators treated them like scripture because they needed something real to hold. They photographed them, logged them, stored them, returned to them. And as the years passed, the tie became less like evidence and more like an altar. Because everything else was gone. The money was gone. The parachute was gone. The man was gone. But the tie remained, a small object carrying the humiliating truth that the government could be outplayed by someone with patience. Then the tips started flooding in. Phones rang day and night. Letters arrived with shaky handwriting. Anonymous calls. Dramatic claims. Quiet claims. Some tips were useless. Some were cruel jokes. Some were the kind of lies people tell because they want to feel close to a famous story. But a few were unsettling. A woman calls and says her husband came home that Thanksgiving with wet clothes and a calm smile and a bruise he wouldn't explain. A coworker says a man at work suddenly quit, moved away, and never spoke to anyone again, right after the hijacking hit the news. A bartender says someone paid in cash, too much cash, and asked a strange question about the wind. None of it was solid. But it was human. And that's how cases become haunted, by the possibility that the truth is sitting inside ordinary life, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, pretending to be normal. One agent, an obsessive one, the kind who couldn't let a case die, began collecting the tips that had one thing in common. Not a name. Not a location. A behavior. Calm. Every interesting tip mentioned calm. Not panic. Not excitement. Calm. A calm man with a plan. A calm man who didn't brag. A calm man who didn't confess. A calm man who didn't want to be seen. And then the agent remembered the detail no one else wanted to touch anymore. The static pulses. The 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 again. He requested the original audio logs again. Listened again. Slower. He wasn't trying to prove magic. He was trying to prove habit. Because if Cooper had a habit, if he repeated a pattern without thinking, then the pattern could exist elsewhere. In another case. In another message. In another crime. He listened until the sounds turned into something like music. And then, there. Again. The same rhythm. The same spacing. 3. Pause. 3. It wasn't evidence. It was a whisper. But whispers were all this case had left. The agent sat back and stared at the wall. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a colder sensation. What if Cooper didn't just escape that night? What if Cooper was the kind of man who kept moving, from identity to identity, from state to state, leaving only small marks behind, never enough to convict him, always enough to keep the chase alive? If that was true, then the case wasn't over. It was only unfinished. And as the sketches spread across America, pinned to bulletin boards and printed in newspapers, Cooper became 2 things at once. A face everyone recognized. And a man no one could find. The agent picked up his pen and wrote a new line at the top of his working file. Stop looking for who he was. Start looking for what he does. Then he underlined the word twice. Pattern. Because if you can't catch a ghost by chasing his shadow, you catch him by catching the thing he repeats, without even realizing he repeats it. And somewhere in the noise of the case, a tiny click waited to be heard again. The same click the crew described. The same click the tape carried. The click that sounded like a latch. A decision. A door closing. The myth didn't become immortal the night he jumped. It became immortal the moment the money was recorded. Because the FBI didn't just hand over cash, they handed over numbers. Serial numbers. A paper trail. A list so long it felt like a net, stretched across the entire country, waiting to tighten around a man who no longer existed. And for the first time since the jump, investigators had something they could track without needing a face. Money doesn't have a memory, but it has an identity. Each bill in that ransom was marked by the system that printed it, and the Bureau treated the list like scripture. If Cooper lived, he would eventually spend. If he spent, the bills would surface. If the bills surfaced, the myth would bleed into reality. That was the theory. But the case didn't care about theory. It cared about silence. Weeks turned into months. The manhunt stayed loud in the public imagination, but in the back offices, the places with file cabinets and coffee stains and tired eyes, the case settled into a routine that felt almost humiliating. Agents called banks. They called stores. They mailed bulletins. They asked tellers to watch for certain serial numbers. They asked managers to pay attention to large cash deposits. They asked the country to notice what the country was built to ignore, ordinary money passing through ordinary hands. And for a while, nothing happened. No jackpot moment. No dramatic capture. No cashier shouting, "This is Cooper's bill." Just a slow realization that if Cooper was alive, he wasn't acting like a man who needed to spend. Which meant one of three things. He was dead. He was hiding the money. Or he was laundering it in a way that made the entire list meaningless. And that third possibility, the clever one, was what kept the agents awake. Because laundering didn't always mean shady banks and criminal networks. Not in 1971. Sometimes laundering meant patience. Sometimes laundering meant time. Sometimes laundering meant living like a man who didn't suddenly come into $200,000, because he understood that money can be a spotlight. The Bureau began to imagine him in scenes that made their skin crawl. A man in a modest house, paying bills on time. A man driving an ordinary car, never speeding, never drawing attention. A man who watched the news reports about himself with a calm expression, as if it were a story about someone else. That calm again. Always calm. And then a new type of tip began to appear, less dramatic, more practical. Not, "I know who he is," but, "My coworker suddenly started paying cash. My neighbor paid off his loan. My uncle became careful with receipts. A guy at the bar said he'd never trust banks again." Tiny human changes that could mean anything, and could mean everything. The Bureau created a second list, not of serial numbers, but of behaviors. The sudden quiet improvements. The new caution around money. The men who stopped being impulsive overnight. It was ridiculous on paper. But in a case like this, you chase what you can chase. One agent, young enough to still feel anger, slammed a file down on a desk one night. "We're looking for a ghost," he said. "And we're trying to catch him with a grocery receipt." The older agent didn't even look up. "We're trying to catch him with time," he said. That was the difference between them. Young investigators wanted the case to end like a movie. Old investigators knew cases end like rot, slow, quiet, unavoidable, if you wait long enough. And they waited. They waited so long that the case began to change shape. It stopped being a manhunt. It became a cultural object. People started treating Cooper like folklore, An outlaw without blood on his hands, a thief with charm, a mystery you could enjoy. Some even admired him. The investigators hated that part most. Because admiration made witnesses unreliable. It made confessions contaminated. It made liars multiply. And as the years passed, another danger grew: copycats. Men who wanted the legend. Men who wanted to be Cooper. Men who would confess just to sit near the myth like a campfire and feel its warmth. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Anonymous. No return address. The handwriting careful, almost too careful, like someone writing with their non-dominant hand. Inside, a single line. You're listening for the wrong thing. No signature. No threat. Just that sentence. It could have been a prank. But the agent holding it felt something tighten in his chest, because it sounded like a message Cooper would leave. Not emotional, not poetic, just instructive. And at the bottom of the paper, near the edge, there was a mark. Not a signature. Not a symbol. A small, dark dot. The same kind of dot the flight attendant described. The agent's mouth went dry. He told himself it was coincidence. That a dot was a dot. That anyone could make a dot. But his hands didn't believe him. His hands moved the paper under light like it was evidence. He measured the dot. He photographed it. He compared it to older documents. And he noticed something that made his skin prickle. The dot wasn't random ink. It looked pressed, like something touched the page and left a perfect, compact circle. A stamp, maybe. Or the end of a pen held against paper for a fraction too long. A habit. A pattern. The older agent walked in, saw the paper, and immediately understood the look on the younger man's face. Don't fall in love with it, the older agent warned. I'm not, the younger agent said. But his voice betrayed him. Because he already had. Not with the dot. With the possibility that the case had just breathed. They sent the paper through analysis. They checked for prints. Fibers. Anything. Days passed. Nothing conclusive. And that was the cruelty of this case. It offered crumbs that smelled like bread but might have been dust. The younger agent sat alone one night, listening again to the old audiolog, the intercom static that the crew described, the pulsing rhythm nobody could prove mattered. 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 again. He stared at the anonymous note. You're listening for the wrong thing. He replayed the tape. Again. Again. And then he realized what the sentence might mean. Maybe the pulses weren't a signal from Cooper. Maybe the pulses were a signal for Cooper. A timing device. A cue. A countdown. His heartbeat quickened. He pulled the timeline of the flight. Marked key minutes. Calculated the spacing between reported events. The stair deployment. The shudder. The drag change. The moment they believed he jumped. He started mapping sound to action. And for the first time in years, the case stopped feeling like a fog and started feeling like a machine. A machine with steps. A machine with timing. A machine built by someone who believed the perfect crime wasn't just disappearing. It was controlling what people heard while you did it. The younger agent grabbed his coat and walked fast down the hallway to the older agent's office, the note still in his hand. He didn't knock. He didn't ask permission. He just put the paper on the desk and said the one sentence that can resurrect a dead investigation. I think the tape is telling us when he moved. The older agent stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at the dot. And for the first time in years, his eyes didn't look tired. They looked afraid. They didn't call it a breakthrough. Not yet. In the bureau, you don't say breakthrough until you have something you can hand a prosecutor without being laughed out of the room. You say angle. You say possibility. You say, we should take another look. But when the younger agent said, I think the tape is telling us when he moved, the older agent didn't dismiss him. He reached into a drawer and pulled out the original flight timeline, handwritten notes, ranges, estimates. Times that had been argued over for years because nobody saw the jump. They only felt it. He set the pages side by side with the audio log transcripts. Static bursts. Pauses. Bursts again. Play it, the older agent said. The younger agent rewound the tape and pressed play. The hiss filled the office like a leak in reality. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was persistent. 3 short pops. Pause. 3 again. The older agent closed his eyes, listening with the kind of focus that made the room feel smaller. He didn't listen like a man searching for sound. He listened like a man searching for timing. Again, he said. The tape rewound. The pattern returned. 3. Pause. 3. Mark the interval, the older agent said. The younger agent grabbed a stopwatch. He waited for the first pop and started the timer. He counted in his head like a drummer trying to keep a beat steady through noise. When the second burst ended, he stopped. He wrote the number down. Then he did it again. And again. The numbers weren't identical. They couldn't be. The tape was old, the recording messy, the electrical environment unstable. But they clustered around the same window like birds returning to a familiar wire. A repeating rhythm. A metronome. The older agent opened his eyes. Now, he said, tell me why a hijacker needs a metronome. The younger agent hesitated, then spoke carefully, because he knew how insane it would sound if he said it too fast. He needs timing, he said. He needs to know when something happens without seeing it. The older agent leaned back in his chair. Like what? He asked. The younger agent spread the timeline across the desk. Cabin pressure changes. Flight path corrections. The moment the crew is distracted. The moment they stop listening for him and start listening to each other. The older agent nodded slowly. And the stairs, he said. Yes. The younger agent replied. The stairs. Because the aft stairs were the heart of the case. The thing Cooper chose the Boeing 727 for. The thing he built the plan around. A door in the sky. If Cooper needed a metronome, it meant he wasn't improvising on the stairs. He was executing steps. He was waiting for the exact moment the aircraft reached the conditions he wanted. Low altitude. Low speed. Flaps set. Landing gear position. Wind. A pilot's environment. A man who understood planes, or a man who understood how to read instructions like scripture. The older agent tapped the timeline. Where do you think he was when the pulses began? He asked. The younger agent's mouth felt dry. Preparing, he said. Strapping the money. Checking the harness. Testing the door. Waiting for the crew to settle. And when the pulses change? The older agent asked. The younger agent pointed at the section of the transcript where the hiss stretched longer. Here, he said. A transition. A commitment point. Like stepping onto the stairs. The older agent stared at the papers for a long time, then said something that sounded almost like a confession. I've been in this job long enough to know one thing, he said. When you can't see the crime, you chase the shadow. And the shadow is always timing. The younger agent nodded. He wanted to feel triumphant. He wanted to feel like he'd just dragged the case back from the grave. But instead he felt fear. Because if Cooper used timing like this, then Cooper wasn't just calm. He was precise. And precision meant training, or obsession. The older agent stood and walked to the window. Outside, rain traced thin lines down the glass, turning streetlights into smeared halos. He didn't look at the rain as weather. He looked at it as an accomplice. Okay, he said finally, turning back. Let's assume you're right. The younger agent swallowed. Assume the pulses are a cue, the older agent continued. Assume the jump wasn't chaos. Assume it was scheduled. He pointed at the map, the crude circle that had been drawn years earlier, the circle that kept shifting because the data never agreed with itself. Then we searched the wrong place, he said. The younger agent's heart thudded. Not the wrong forest, the older agent added. The wrong exit. He grabbed a pencil and drew a line that cut through the circle and kept going. Toward the kind of terrain nobody liked to talk about in search meetings. Roads. Small towns. Gas stations. The places where a man could re-enter the world. Because the ugliest truth about wilderness searches is this. They assume the wilderness is the ending. But for a man with a plan, wilderness might be only the middle. A brief tunnel between identities. The older agent sat back down and opened a thin folder marked with a single word, Cooper. Inside were dozens of tips that had been dismissed over the years because they were too soft, too human, too ordinary. A man bought rope and a map and never came back to the store. A man appeared at a diner wet and shaking, paid cash, and left without eating. A man in a suit walked along a rural road at dawn, no car in sight. Most of it was noise. But when you have a metronome, you stop looking for noise. You look for anything that fits the beat. The older agent slid the folder toward the younger one. Find me the tips that match the timeline, he said. Not the face. Not the name. The timing. The younger agent nodded, then stopped. There's something else, he said. The older agent looked up. The note, the younger agent said. The anonymous one. You're listening for the wrong thing, the older agent recited. Yes, the younger agent said. What if that's not a taunt? What if it's instruction? The older agent's eyes narrowed. Instruction from who? He asked. The younger agent didn't answer immediately, because the answer sounded like fantasy, even in a room that had been built to handle the impossible. From someone who knows the case, he said carefully. Someone who knows the tape exists. Someone who knows we keep replaying it. The older agent stared at him. That could be anybody with access to newspapers, he said. It could. The younger agent agreed. But the dot. The older agent held up a hand. Don't worship the dot, he said again. I'm not. The younger agent lied. Because he was. Not as proof. As a feeling. As the sensation that someone had leaned close to the investigation and whispered, warmer. The older agent exhaled through his nose. Here's what I believe, he said. The man who did this, Dan Cooper, D.B. Cooper, whatever he was, he didn't want to be caught. He paused. But he wanted to be remembered. The D.B. Cooper case remains famous because the hijacker took ransom money and parachutes and then vanished after jumping from a plane, with no confirmed identity or body. The younger agent stared at the map again. And if he wanted to be remembered, he said, then he might still be nearby. The older agent didn't respond. He only reached out, turned the tape off, and let the room fall into silence. Then, in that silence, he said the sentence that changed the mood from investigation to hunt. Tomorrow, he said, we stop searching for a man. He tapped the transcript. We search for the metronome. And outside, rain kept falling, steady, timed, relentless, like the sky itself was counting. The most dangerous moment in a cold case isn't when evidence disappears. It's when the story becomes so famous that the story starts rewriting the evidence. In 1971, the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper took ransom money and parachutes and then vanished after jumping from a Boeing 727, and his identity was never conclusively confirmed. That single fact created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. They get filled. They get filled with documentaries, jokes, barroom legends, confident, I know who it was, stories, and smiling theories that turn a real crime into a campfire tale. And once the myth is big enough, it begins to protect the truth. Not by hiding it, but by burying it under noise. Inside the bureau, the older agent had a private rule. When a case becomes entertainment, the case becomes contaminated. Because now every tip is suspect, not only because people lie, but because people believe their own lies. They see the sketch in the newspaper and their brain edits a memory to match. They watch a reenactment and their brain replaces a real detail with a cinematic one. They hear a rumor and suddenly they always knew something felt off about their coworker. A myth doesn't just attract liars. It manufactures witnesses. The older agent pinned a new sheet to the wall above his desk. Not a suspect. Not a map. A list. The myth machine. Fame creates confessions. Confessions create suspects. Suspects create false certainty. False certainty kills real leads. He underlined the last line twice. Then he did something that felt almost insulting to the people who'd chased this case for years. He started removing things. He removed the colorful rumors first. Mexico, secret partners, dramatic last words. Gone. He removed the friend of a friend stories. Gone. He removed the tips that arrived with a perfect narrative arc, like the sender had written it for a movie. Gone. What remained was smaller, colder, and far more honest. A man boarded under a false name. A note was passed. Demands were made. Money and parachutes were delivered. Passengers were released. The plane took off. The aft stairs went down. The aircraft's drag changed. The man was gone. That was the skeleton. Everything else was flesh. People wanted to add. The younger agent hated this part. Not because it was wrong, but because it made the case feel less romantic. Less legendary. More brutal. It also made a terrifying possibility more visible. If you stripped the legend away, the hijacker wasn't superhuman. He was competent. And competence is common. Competence meant there could be hundreds of men who could have done it, and only one who did. The older agent sat across from the younger one late one night, both of them tired, both of them smelling faintly of coffee and wet paper. "You want a face," the older agent said. "I want an ending," the younger agent replied. The older agent nodded. "Then stop chasing the loud parts." He tapped the audio transcript, the static bursts they'd turned into a metronome. "Everyone hears the hijacking," he said. "Nobody hears the timing." The younger agent stared at the page. 3 short pops, pause, 3 again, and the dot. The younger agent asked before he could stop himself. The older agent's eyes narrowed. "The dot is a trap," he said. But then his voice softened, just slightly. "Still," he admitted, "traps sometimes point the way out." They pulled out every statement again and rebuilt the timeline from the beginning, not as a story, but as a sequence of actions with motives. Why 4 parachutes? To prevent sabotage, or to create the appearance of preventing sabotage, which is a different kind of intelligence. Why release the passengers? To reduce chaos. To reduce witnesses. To reduce variables. Why choose a Boeing 727? Because of the rear stairs, because it offered an exit no other common aircraft offered in the same way. And then the most uncomfortable question of all. Why leave the tie? A man who planned everything doesn't leave a tie by accident. Not unless he didn't care. Not unless the tie wasn't his. Not unless leaving it served him. The younger agent said it quietly, like blasphemy. What if he wanted us to have something? The older agent didn't answer immediately. Because if that was true, it meant Cooper didn't just escape. He performed. And performance meant ego. Ego meant a need to be seen, even while hiding. That's when the older agent introduced a new concept. Not a suspect list. A filter. A personality filter. "Find me a man," he said, "who can do 2 things at once, disappear and still demand attention without speaking." The younger agent frowned. "How do you demand attention without speaking?" The older agent tapped the metronome transcript. "Like this," he said. "You create a pattern that makes the investigator's chase sound." He tapped the list of serial numbers. "Like this," he said. "You make money into bait." He tapped the tie. "Like this," he said. "You leave an ordinary object that becomes sacred." Then he looked up. "And you never, ever, give them closure." The younger agent felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Because closure is what cops want. And denial of closure is what manipulators love. For the first time, the younger agent understood the case not as a mystery, but as a relationship, between a criminal and a system he humiliated. The older agent opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters, tips, confessions, claims. "Tonight," he said, "we don't read these for names." He handed them over like a priest handing over forbidden pages. "We read these for language." They began sorting by tone. Angry confessions went in one pile. Showy confessions went in another. Confessions that sounded like someone auditioning, another pile. Then they found a small group that felt different. Letters that were too controlled, too clean, too professional. One letter in particular was only a few lines long. No drama. No biography. No plea. Just a statement. "You won't find him where you're looking. You're building a story, not a map." The younger agent stared at it. The older agent leaned closer. At the bottom edge of the paper, there was a tiny pressed mark. A dot. The younger agent's pulse quickened. "This. Don't," the older agent warned. But his own eyes didn't leave the dot. Because the dot wasn't proof. It was a smell in the air. A hint that someone had leaned close enough to the case to breathe on it. The younger agent felt the old fear return, the one that made his imagination run ahead of his professionalism. Fantasy B. Not supernatural. Not aliens. Not magic. Just the unsettling possibility that a human being could play with time and attention so well that he could remain present in an investigation without ever appearing. The older agent stood, walked to the wall map, and circled one area again, harder than before. "Tomorrow," he said, "we stop asking who he was." He turned back, eyes sharp. "We ask who would enjoy this." The younger agent swallowed. "Enjoy it how?" The older agent picked up the metronome transcript and folded it once, carefully, like a ritual. "Enjoy watching professionals chase him for decades," he said. "Enjoy watching the country argue about him. Enjoy knowing he left a mark that keeps breathing." He slid the paper back into the file. Then he added the sentence that made the room feel colder than the rain outside. "And if he enjoyed it, he might have done something else." The younger agent stared at him. "Another job?" he asked. The older agent nodded once. "Another pattern," he said. "Another dot." And the moment he said that, the case stopped being a single night in 1971. It became a doorway. Because if there was another pattern out there, another crime with the same calm, the same timing, the same silence, then D.B. Cooper wasn't just a hijacker who vanished. He was a mind with a signature. And signatures can be found if you know where to look. By the time a case reaches legend status, suspects don't get found. They get manufactured. Because America couldn't accept a man who vanished without leaving a name, the system started doing what systems do best, generating options until one of them felt like certainty. On paper, the case was still simple: one hijacker, one flight, one jump, one disappearance. In reality, it had become a machine that turned rumors into faces. The older agent called it the suspect factory. It had 3 ingredients: a man who looked ordinary, a crime with no clean ending, and a public that needed the ending to exist. Every few months, a new file landed on the desk like a prophecy. A name. A photo. A story from someone's ex-wife, someone's drinking buddy, someone's cousin who swore he heard the truth at a kitchen table in 1973. The younger agent learned quickly that most suspect stories had the same smell. Too dramatic. Too perfect. Too eager to be believed. They came with clean motivations: he needed money, he hated the government, he was a genius, and clean timelines that always, somehow, placed the suspect exactly where he needed to be. Real life is messier than that. So the older agent built rules. Rule 1: if the story begins with, "I never told anyone this," it usually ends with, "because it isn't true." Rule 2: if the suspect conveniently dies right before the story becomes public, treat it like a sales pitch. Rule 3: if the tip sounds like a movie trailer, it's probably written by someone who watches too many. But the hard part wasn't rejecting the obvious lies. The hard part was the ones that almost worked. Because some suspects fit in a way that made your stomach tighten. The right age. The right build. The right calm. A record that showed discipline. And a history that showed resentment. A man who knew parachutes. A man who knew planes. A man who knew how to keep his mouth shut. And yet, every time the team pushed deeper, the same problem returned like a curse. No anchor. No fingerprint that held. No document that locked a name to the seat. No undeniable proof that the man in the file had ever been Dan Cooper. The case didn't want to be solved by identity. It wanted to be solved by behavior. So the older agent changed the question. He stopped asking, who could have done it? He started asking, who would do it like this? Who releases passengers, not out of kindness, but out of control? Who asks for 4 parachutes, not because it's needed, but because it forces the authorities' hands? Who stays polite, because politeness is a mask that keeps people from panicking too soon? And who disappears without trying to be famous, unless the fame is the point? The younger agent didn't like that last thought. Because once you admit the criminal might enjoy the chase, you're no longer investigating a crime. You're negotiating with a personality. Late one night, they laid the strongest suspect files on a table. Not dozens, only the ones that survived the first cuts. The ones that made experienced agents pause before dismissing them. They studied each one in silence. Each file had a different flavor of tragedy. A man who drank too hard after the war. A man who lost money and lost pride and started planning in secret. A man who loved aviation so much he resented the world for not respecting him. And as they turned pages, the younger agent noticed something that made his skin prickle. The best suspects weren't the wild ones. They were the quiet ones. Men who didn't brag. Men who didn't pick fights. Men who didn't tell stories to impress strangers. Men who could carry a secret without it poisoning their face. Calm men, the younger agent whispered. The older agent nodded. Calm men, he agreed. Then he did something that felt almost unfair. He removed the faces. He covered the photos with plain paper. Now, he said, read only the actions. Without photos, the files became scarier. The suspects stopped being people and became patterns. Training, temperament, disappearance, sudden life changes after 1971. The younger agent realized the horrifying truth of the suspect factory. If you remove the face, many men can fit the shape. And that meant the solution might not be hiding in the suspect list at all. It might be hiding in something smaller. Something quieter. A tiny signature that didn't care which name wore it. The older agent reached into the Cooper file and pulled out a page the younger agent had almost forgotten. A copy of that anonymous message from years later. You won't find him where you're looking. No confession. No name. No threats. Just instruction. At the bottom, a pressed dot. The younger agent stared at it like it could blink. I know, the older agent said, reading his mind. It's probably nothing. But his voice didn't sound convinced. The younger agent swallowed. If it's nothing, he asked, why does it feel like he's still here? The older agent didn't answer immediately. He walked to the wall map and traced the flight path with his finger. Slowly, like a priest tracing a ritual symbol. Then he stopped at the point they believed was the jump window and tapped it twice. Because a case like this, he said quietly, doesn't stay alive unless someone keeps feeding it. The younger agent's chest tightened. You think Cooper fed it? I think, the older agent said, that Cooper understood one thing most criminals don't. He turned back, eyes sharp. Silence can be louder than a confession. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder marked with a different case number. Not Cooper. Not the hijacking. Something else. The younger agent frowned. What's that? The older agent placed the folder on the table, gentle, almost respectful, like he was setting down a weapon. A pattern, he said. The younger agent felt the room tilt. Because the folder wasn't thick. It wasn't famous. It wasn't legend. It was the kind of file that lives in the shadows of the system, unloved, unnoticed. But on the cover, in the corner where someone had written a tiny note in pencil, there was a mark. Not a signature. Not a symbol. A dot. And the older agent's voice dropped to a whisper. Tell me this doesn't look familiar. The folder looked harmless. Not thick enough to matter. Not famous enough to attract conspiracy. Not dramatic enough to become a documentary. And that was exactly why it terrified the younger agent. Because legends are loud. But patterns are quiet. The older agent didn't open it right away. He let it sit on the table between them like a dare. Like the case itself was asking a question neither man wanted to answer. You want a face, he said. The system always wants a face. That's why the suspect factory never stops. He tapped the folder once with his finger. But a face is what a man changes. A pattern is what he forgets to change. The younger agent kept staring at the pencil mark in the corner, oppressed. Small. Clean. Too intentional to be an accident, yet too meaningless to be proof. Where did this come from? He asked. The older agent finally opened the file. Inside were ordinary pages, reports, statements, timestamps, a short timeline that didn't have the mythic elegance of Flight 305. No ransom demands. No parachutes. No headlines. Just a sequence of events with one common disease: missing certainty. The older agent slid the first page across. Read the timeline, he said. Don't read the story. The younger agent scanned it. He saw a date. A place. A routine situation that turned into an irregular silence. The kind of case that never becomes famous because it doesn't offer the public a clean villain. But the structure felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. A calm beginning. A controlled middle. A gap where the crucial moment happened off witness. And an ending that refused to end. This is... The younger agent started. Not Cooper. The older agent finished. The younger agent looked up. Then why is it in your drawer? Because of the metronome, the older agent said. He reached into the Cooper file and pulled out the audio transcript again, the static pulses that had become their obsession. 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 again. Then he pointed at a line in the new file's notes. A witness mention. A strange audio artifact. A repeated interference that someone had dismissed as equipment noise. Not the same words. Not the same context. But the same shape. The younger agent's pulse picked up. That's not evidence, he said, automatically. I know, the older agent replied. He sounded almost tired. Not tired of work, tired of how the world demanded proof from things that were designed to be unprovable. But tell me this, he said. If you were building the perfect disappearance, what would you hide first? The younger agent didn't answer. Your name, the older agent said. Your face. Your money. Your motive. He leaned closer. And what would you accidentally keep? The younger agent swallowed. Your habits. Exactly. The older agent sat back and spoke like a man describing weather. Cooper's genius, if we call it genius, wasn't the jump. It was how he engineered uncertainty. He created a climax nobody could witness. In 1971, the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper extorted money and parachutes and vanished after jumping from a Boeing 727, with no confirmed identity. The younger agent stared at the line, and the case suddenly felt less like history and more like a living thing that had crawled into the room. The older agent turned another page in the second file and revealed something the younger agent hadn't noticed yet: a small, mundane receipt, an inventory note, the kind that usually meant nothing. Except this one had a tiny pressed circle at the bottom edge. Not ink spilled. Not a coffee stain. A dot. The same kind of dot. The younger agent felt his mouth go dry. This could be coincidence, he said, but his voice didn't carry conviction. The older agent nodded once. It probably is, he said, and then he added, until it isn't. He pointed at the dot. You know what the dot does? He asked. The younger agent shook his head. It makes you look twice, the older agent said. It forces your brain to search for meaning. It's a hook. A quiet hook. He paused, eyes narrowing. And if Cooper was the type of man who enjoyed control, what's more controlling than making investigators chase a mark they can't prove matters? The younger agent didn't like where this was going. You're saying he communicated, he said. I'm saying he might have, the older agent replied. Or someone who wanted to impersonate him might have. Either way, it changes the hunt. The younger agent stared at the paperwork again. The second file was not a hijacking, not a ransom, not even a famous crime. But it carried a familiar taste, a crime that refused closure. A crime that left behind just enough to keep the mind turning. What do we do with this? He asked. The older agent stood, walked to the map, and drew a circle. Not around forests, not around rivers, but around human infrastructure. Towns, highways, motels, diners. Cooper doesn't have to be a ghost in the trees, he said. He can be a ghost among people. He tapped the circle. If this other file has anything to do with him, or with the same kind of mind, then the mistake we've made for years is the same one we always make. The younger agent looked up. Which is? We search where we would die, the older agent said. Not where we would live. Silence filled the room again. Then the younger agent noticed something else, a stamp on the second file's cover. Old. Official. Nearly faded. A department label that didn't belong to the bureau. It was from another jurisdiction. Another agency. Another set of people who had no idea their paperwork might be sitting beside the most famous disappearance in American crime. Who gave you this? The younger agent asked. The older agent hesitated, just long enough to make the answer frightening. A man who shouldn't have, he said. The younger agent felt a cold pressure behind his ribs. Meaning? The older agent didn't answer directly. He lifted the Cooper transcript again, held it beside the second file, and for the first time his voice lost its professional dryness. What if we're not the only ones still listening? He whispered. The younger agent stared at him. What if someone out there is listening to us listening? The room felt smaller. The rain outside felt louder. The case, so old, so famous, so untouchable, suddenly felt close enough to breathe on the back of the younger agent's neck. Then the phone rang. A simple desk phone ring, ordinary, sharp, wrong in the silence. The older agent stared at it like it might be a trap. It rang again. He picked it up slowly. Yeah, he said. He listened. His face didn't change much, but the color drained from it in a way the younger agent noticed immediately. He covered the receiver and looked at the younger agent. We just got a tip, he said quietly. The younger agent's pulse spiked. About Cooper? The older agent's eyes stayed fixed, unblinking. About a man, he said, who paid cash for something strange, and left a dot on the paper. By now, the case had done something no hijacker was supposed to do. It had outlived the people chasing it. In 1971, the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper extorted money and parachutes and then vanished after jumping from a Boeing 727, with no confirmed identity. And that meant Chapter 13 couldn't be another chase through trees, another wall of names, another suspect who fit the face. It had to be something colder. A reckoning. Because when a mystery survives long enough, there are only two options left. Either the truth is simple, and the world refuses to accept it, or the truth is complicated, and the world never had a chance. The older agent cleared the table. Not in anger. In respect. He lined up the anchors of the case like exhibits in a courtroom where the defendant had never shown up. A one-way ticket under a false name. A note. A bomb claim. A ransom demand. 4 parachutes. Passengers released. A second flight. The aft stairs. A shutter. A drag change. A man gone. Then he placed the other artifacts beside them, things the public loved, things the Bureau distrusted. The tie, the money serial numbers list, the endless tips, the anonymous messages, the dot, the metronome. He looked at the younger agent. "Now we do it the honest way," he said. The younger agent nodded, even though the honest way was painful. Because the honest way admits something most people hate. You can do everything right and still not know what we know for sure. The older agent spoke slowly, like he was building a wall stone by stone. A man used the name Dan Cooper to board Flight 305. He claimed he had a bomb and proved enough to be taken seriously. He demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He released the passengers after the exchange. The plane took off again under conditions he requested. The rear stairs were deployed in flight. At some point after that, the crew believed he jumped. After landing, he was not on the aircraft. The younger agent listened. No drama. No myth. Just the skeleton. Then the older agent added the sentence that turned the room cold. Everything else is interpretation. What stays disputed? Now the younger agent spoke, because his mind lived in the disputed zones. The jump point. The exact time of the jump. Whether the bomb was real. Whether he had formal parachute training. Whether he survived. And then the big poison question. If he survived, where did the money go? Because the money was the trap. If he spends it, he exposes himself. If he hides it, it becomes useless. If he loses it, the entire crime becomes something else. A performance. A message. A dare. And that's where fantasy be entered. Not supernatural, not impossible. Just the uneasy feeling that some people commit crimes for reasons that don't fit normal logic. Not money. Not anger. Control. The 3 strongest versions. The older agent wrote them on a clean sheet of paper, leaving space beneath each like a ledger waiting for entries. Version 1. He died that night, the wilderness wins. This version is brutal because it is simple. Bad weather. Night jump. Heavy money. Unforgiving terrain. A man hits the ground wrong, breaks something, bleeds quietly, freezes, and becomes part of the landscape. The parachute rots. The body disappears the way bodies disappear when nature has time. The case stays unsolved because the forest doesn't return what it takes. The younger agent hated this version because it felt like an ending without a villain. But the older agent respected it because it didn't require magic. It required only physics. And physics is undefeated. Version 2. He survived, the clean escape. This is the version America secretly loves. The outlaw who outsmarts the system. The calm man who disappears into ordinary life. The ghost who watches the manhunt on TV with a neutral face. In this version, Cooper lands closer to a road than people want to admit. He hides the parachute. He changes clothes. He becomes a passerby. A hitchhiker. A man with cash who understands that cash is dangerous. He doesn't spend big. He spends slowly, or not at all. He survives because he planned not only the jump, but the hours after the jump. And that means he didn't just have a parachute plan. He had a life plan. The younger agent found this version terrifying for a different reason. It meant Cooper could have been anywhere, living next to anyone, the whole time. Not in the forest. In the world. Version 3. He wasn't alone, the assisted exit. This version doesn't require a second hijacker with a gun. It requires something quieter. A helper. Not necessarily on the plane. Not necessarily even someone who knew the whole plan. Just someone who provided a piece, an introduction, a tool, a timing cue, a safe address, a ride. The metronome pulses suddenly mattered here, because timing is what you use when you're coordinating with an outside reality you can't see. And the dot, the pressed dot, the tiny signature, felt like the kind of mark a meticulous person repeats without thinking, the way some people always fold paper the same way. The older agent didn't say, conspiracy. He said something more professional, more frightening. Shared behavior. If Cooper was helped, then the case could echo in another file. Another jurisdiction. Another quiet disappearance where the climax happened off-witness. And then the Cooper case wouldn't be a one-time miracle. It would be a style. What the case does to people. The younger agent finally asked the question that had been sitting in his throat for months. What do you believe? The older agent looked tired, but not defeated. I believe, he said, that the case is smaller than the myth, and smarter than the public. He pointed to version 1. Nature could have ended him. He pointed to version 2. Planning could have saved him. He pointed to version 3. And ego could have made him leave fingerprints without leaving prints. Then he leaned in, voice lowering. And I believe one of these versions has a weak spot we haven't pressed hard enough. The younger agent's pulse rose. Which one? The older agent didn't answer. He simply reached into the drawer and pulled out the latest tip, the one that had come in after midnight. Paid cash. Bought something strange. Left a dot on the paper. He placed it on the table and tapped the tiny mark once. Tomorrow, he said, we decide whether this dot is nothing, or whether it's the only honest signature the man ever left. The younger agent stared at it, feeling the old sensation again, the feeling that the case was listening back. Not with ghosts. With a mind. And minds repeat themselves. The next morning didn't arrive with answers. It arrived with paperwork. A phone number. A location scribbled on a memo. A clerk who remembered a comm man. A receipt that might have been nothing, until you stared at it long enough to feel your own mind trying to turn it into destiny. They drove in silence. Rain again, thin and patient, streaking across the windshield like the world was trying to erase its own face. The older agent didn't talk about Cooper on the way. He didn't need to. The case had been living between them for too long. When they reached the place from the tip, it wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. Too ordinary. A counter. Fluorescent lights. The smell of old coffee and paper. A tired employee who looked at two government men and immediately wished he was somewhere else. The younger agent asked the questions the way he'd learned to ask them. Calm, neutral, non-leading. Do you remember anyone unusual? The clerk shrugged. People are unusual every day. Do you remember a man paying cash for something strange? Another shrug. Then hesitation. Then a small change in the clerk's eyes, the moment someone realizes they do remember something, but they don't want to, because remembering makes you part of the story. Yeah, the clerk said finally. A guy. How did he look? Normal, the clerk said, almost irritated. Suit. Polite. Like he didn't want to take up space. The older agent's jaw tightened at the word polite. The younger agent leaned in slightly. Did he say anything? The clerk stared at the counter as if the countertop could supply the memory. He asked one question, the clerk said. Not weird. Just specific. What question? The clerk swallowed. He asked what time the weather usually rolls in around here. The younger agent felt a cold line slide down his spine. Weather. Timing. A metronome made out of real life. The older agent asked gently, do you still have the receipt? The clerk opened a drawer and pulled out a thin strip of paper like it was trash. He set it down like he didn't want to touch it too long. The older agent didn't reach for it immediately. He just looked. Then he turned it slightly under the light. And there it was. At the bottom edge, a small, pressed dot. Clean, deliberate, too perfect to be accidental. The younger agent stared at it as if it might blink. This could be anyone, he whispered. The older agent nodded once. It could. The younger agent's mind raced the way it always did when a case offered a shape instead of a truth. A prankster feeding the legend. A copycat leaving a signature to feel powerful. A clerk unconsciously marking paper with the end of a pen. A coincidence. Or the sickest possibility of all. A man who had escaped once, watching the investigators like a mirror, amused by how easily human beings fall in love with patterns. The older agent slid the receipt into an evidence bag with slow care. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, not looking up. "A lead," the younger agent said. The older agent shook his head. "It's a choice," he replied. "We can chase it forever, or we can do what the public never does." He paused. "We can admit what we truly have." Back at the office, they laid everything out again, but this time, without hope and without theater. The Cooper file. The timeline. The tie. The list of serial numbers. The endless names that fit until they didn't. And then the receipt with the dot. The younger agent waited for the older one to declare a new hunt, a new task force, a new obsession. Instead, the older agent sat down and wrote a title on a blank page. "What we can say without lying." Then he wrote the only sentence that remained true no matter how much the world argued. In 1971, a hijacker using the name Dan Cooper extorted $200,000 in parachutes, released the passengers, and vanished after jumping from a Boeing 727. His true identity and ultimate fate were never conclusively confirmed. He stopped. The younger agent stared at the words. They felt like failure. But the older agent didn't look defeated. He looked clear. "This is the part people hate," the older agent said. "Because they think a story needs an ending to be real." He tapped the paper. "Uncertainty is real," he said. "It's just not satisfying." The younger agent stared at the receipt again. "And the dot?" he asked. The older agent looked at it for a long time. "The dot," he said quietly, "is either a coincidence." He paused, then continued. "Or it's the kind of mark a man leaves when he wants to be remembered without being caught." The younger agent felt the case tighten around his throat one last time, like a hand testing its grip. "So which is it?" he asked. The older agent didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain and the streetlights and the ordinary world that made disappearances possible. Then he spoke without turning around. "Here's the final truth," he said. "This case doesn't end with a name. It ends with a question." He turned back, eyes steady. "If you believe he died, then the wilderness won, and the legend is just the echo of a bad jump." He raised one finger. "If you believe he lived, then you have to accept something colder, that the world is full of men who can do impossible things once, and then become ordinary again." Second finger. "And if you believe he was helped, then the Cooper case isn't a miracle. It's a method." Third finger. The younger agent stared at him. "And what do you believe?" he asked. The older agent's mouth tightened, not with anger, with honesty. "I believe," he said, "that the most frightening part of this case is not whether he lived or died." He tapped the desk lightly. "It's that we can't prove either," he said. "And that means the myth can keep feeding itself forever." The younger agent looked down at the paper, at the sentence that could be said without lying. Then he looked at the evidence bag with the dot. A tiny mark. A tiny hook. A tiny invitation for the mind to never stop. The older agent closed the file, not like a man giving up, but like a man refusing to be controlled. And before the younger agent could speak, the older agent added one final line at the bottom of the page. The last question. Did D.B. Cooper survive the jump, or did the story survive him? The room went quiet. Outside, rain kept falling. And somewhere, if he lived, maybe a man was listening to the world still arguing about him, still building him into something larger than a person. Or maybe the only thing listening was the wilderness itself. Either way, the case had achieved what few criminals ever achieve. Not victory. Immortality.